introduction. I fear that you're only going to leave the room disappointed now, having listened to that. I'm extremely jealous of the reputation you've given me. I'm going to talk to this topic, which I don't think gives much away, and hopefully by the end of the presentation you'll have some idea what it is meant to be about. So I've chosen this topic of human nature and institution design. What I'm going to do is talk about some issues in general and then relate it to two specific projects that are sort of work in progress at the moment. Let me begin with sort of what at least a stylized view of economics believes we spend all of our time doing. And that's to make two core assumptions about human nature. The first assumption, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, is that we believe everybody is out to pursue narrow self-interest. And in that, almost by definition, that means preferences are fixed and known. If they're that simple, they have to be fixed and known. And if you read, for example, Michael Sandel's recent book, I have a review article coming out in the JEL on that very shortly, called What Money Can't Buy, which is sort of a critique of economics. It sort of assumes that's what we all believe as a sort of precondition for his critique. So that's one characterization you hear about economics, and sort of has some validity, but just how much validity I'm going to come back to. And the other is that we have a very narrow concept of rationality as it applies to human beings, and that is that we're very consistent in the choices we make, we're far-sighted, we're typically Bayesian in the way we process information, and we're without emotion. Typically we make decisions on this basis. And again, that's a very stylized view of economics and human nature as economists perceive it. And again, you could say, if you've only ever taken one course in economics, and it's very basic course, you might think you don't get out beyond that very narrow notion of human nature. Now, you could say that our sort of core analysis, for example, of the market system hinges on this rather stylized view, at least the first part. So there's this famous quote that is overused from Adam Smith that basically points out that most of the things that we enjoy, whether they're iPhones or bread or any kind of basic goods, we enjoy because individuals who produce them and sell them to us on the basis of their self-interest. And so the pursuit of an agenda that says, can self-interest to some extent lead to socially desirable outcomes has been a very powerful motivating theme in economics, and this quote from Adam Smith certainly is one of them that's often brought out as a kind of showing that it goes right back to the beginning of the modern discipline in the world of nations. But along the way, there are those, just to show that the sort of first premise that I raised is not completely stylized. Edgeworth in 1881 says the first principle of economics is that every agent is actuated only by self-interest. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that's narrow self-interest, and self-interest could include caring about the well-being of others who are close to us, so one has to be a little careful in knowing what that is about. But the key question there is broadly, does the fact that people act in their self-interest necessarily lead to socially undesirable outcomes? And of course this has got a new lease of life through the whole debate that's gone around about the causes of the financial crisis. Now, of course, economists who study non-market organisation would typically want to broaden their view of human motivation beyond self-interest. So if you think about families, many people would say that at least narrow self-interest is not a very good description of what goes on within most families. Non-profit organisations, people who work for charities and other organisations, it's not that difficult to believe that they may be acting in some non-self-interested capacity. And equally, it has often been argued, although this is perhaps more contentious territory, that people who work in government may even have some higher purpose purpose than self-interest in mind when they choose to do that. And in fact, on the plane coming over, I was reading, there are various studies now by particularly non-economists. I was reading a paper by a guy called Perry that tries to actually have kind of questionnaire-based methods of trying to assess how pro-socially people are oriented, and if you field those questionnaires to people who work in government and similar questionnaires to people who work in the private sector, there's some systematic evidence that based on this questionnaire method at least, the people who work in the public sector appear to have, on the whole, stronger pro-social motivation. This comes out, of course, it's not observing their actions, it's only observing their answers to certain questions. But this is a big topic, particularly outside of economics. How far are people who work in certain kinds of organizations typically more pro-socially motivated? Now, of course, Adam Smith was somewhat schizophrenic. He wrote both The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments. In The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he is very open about the idea that people will have non-self-interested preferences, and that could really matter. So here's a typical quote. He talks about avarice overrates the difference between poverty and riches, ambition between a private and public station, vain glory between obscurity and extensive reputation. The person under the influence of any of these extravagant passions, so maybe he's thinking that only under sort of moments of weakness we are motivated by these forces, is not only miserable in his actual situation, but is often disposed to disturb the peace of society. So when you sort of take away the flowery language, he's saying that if people are motivated by avarice and other things, often this will lead to bad outcomes for society, to put it in a simple way. So Smith himself was aware of the fact that while self-interest might have all these great benefits, as we saw in the earlier quote, he's equally open to the idea that, first of all, people are not always motivated by self-interest, and moreover, that if they are, that would be damaging. So there's a kind of schizophrenia. You know, most economists I know, even if they write down models of self-interest, you hope, and certainly from my experience, are actually nice guys. I don't actually get to know them, so they aren't quite like their models always seem to be. Now, I've been interested in Hayek for a long time, and rarely get a chance to actually put Hayek anywhere in anything I do, but I've got a bit of Hayek in today. This comes from, I can't remember actually where it comes from, but anyway, this is a quote from one of Hayek's works, I've forgotten where it came from. But he's commenting on Smith, and this is really getting to the substance of what I'm going to talk about today. So Smith's chief concern was not so much, and this is with Smith 1, not Smith 2, this is the Smith arguing it's all about self-interest. Smith's chief concern was not so much with what man might occasionally achieve when he was at his best, but that he should have as little opportunity as possible to do harm when he was at his worst. It would be scarcely be too much to claim that the main merit of the individualism which he and his contemporaries advocated is that a system under which men can do least harm. It's a social system which does not depend for its functioning on our finding good men for running it. And this comes to the nub that we often comes around debates about government. Now, is it the case if we all design government, assuming that the people who work in government are going to be good, isn't that going to be our undoing? So, is there some argument for saying we should really make the assumptions, the worst case scenario assumptions, the ones I set out with, and then maybe that's the right way to go about designing our institutions. And that's really what this lecture is going to be about, that argument. And I'm going to talk about two pieces of research which have a bearing on. Now, there's a similar sort of assault on the economic model going on in recent economics, which many of you here may be familiar with, which is the assault on the stylized notions of rationality from behavioral economics, in which we're asked to believe that people, and indeed the evidence from lab experience and other places bears much of this out, that people have self-control problems, that they don't process information in the way that Bayes' law would suggest they ought to, that they have a range of cognitive biases that mean they depart from very stylized models of the kind that we often write down when we're studying how organizations or institutions work. And as I say, this is increasingly well established both in lab experiments and in observational data. And the question is sort of how far when we're thinking about institution design, we want to be taking all of this on board. I don't think we can answer that question in general, by the way, and that's why I want to be interested in specific contexts in which to answer that. I'm interested mostly in organizations today where I think these issues are most interesting. And those are going to be organizations where at least part of what they try to do creates private costs, social as well as private costs and benefits. Now, arguably, there's no organizations in the world where all of what they do is entirely private benefits. I mean, people might have said before the financial crisis that what goes on in the financial sector was all about private goods, but we learned very quickly that when the financial sector goes belly up, there are massive externalities created for all of us that we're still living through. So, you know, even a lot of profit-driven activity, and if we think about damage to the environment in other areas, there's lots of profit-driven activity that ultimately has quite a lot of social components that are important to take into account. And in fact, this whole agenda, which I'm not really going to have time to talk about today, on corporate social responsibility, is to some extent a kind of debate about the blurring of the distinction between the public and private spheres. So I'm kind of interested in organizations where at least part of what happens in that organization has important social consequences, and for the arguments around what we should assume about human nature when designing institutions and trying to make normative claims about those institutions and whether they work well or badly according to some criteria. And the question is, you know, should economists stick to their knitting? This is probably an English phrase, which I shouldn't use here, but anyway, should people basically stick to the core model of narrow self-interest and rationality when designing and analysing institutions, or what are the benefits of diverging from that, or how do we think about the benefits of diverging from that stylized model? And in particular, I'm going to be in the more specific applications, interested in institutions where principal agent problems are right at the core of those institutions. That we are asking somebody to take on some form of delegated authority to act in a particular way that could have social costs. And of course, politics is a very good example of that. We endow people who we ask the governors to have enormous potential power to do good or to do evil with those powers, and so that's a very important principal agent problem that we face in society, and that's why it's going to be a core example. But of course, in order to understand how to design the institutions to work in the public interest, if we hope that that's what we're going to do, we ought to have an understanding of how incentives work and how the rules laid down by those institutions play out. And that's why making the right assumptions about motivation or rationality or whatever they would be are so important, because presumably we're not going to get it right if we make the wrong assumptions. So here's an example, just a random example. It's not really one I'm going to talk about, but I thought it's a good one to illustrate the point, and that's the issue of judicial independence. I would argue, looking back in human history, the point at which we decide to create independent judiciaries is actually a very pivotal point that different countries have made at different points in their history. In particular, it's the key step to making sure that politicians or rulers of any kind operate underneath the law rather than above the law. And we do that very often by creating powerful actors which are independent judiciaries. And most societies have bitten that bullet to pass that point and have created independence and put judges outside of the narrow political sphere. Now, presumably, we think that's a good idea because we have a notion about how judges or whoever run that system are going to be motivated. Because we're creating these powerful independent actors who enforce human rights, to make sure politics stay within the law, to make sure the business plays by the rules, so presumably aren't easily bribed or whatever would be required for that. We need to have a notion of what motivates judges. Are they affected by incentives? And I've done some work on the difference between appointed and elected judges, and you do actually find that there are differences in the way they, I think they preside over anti-discrimination cases, depending on whether they're elected or appointed. So there is some at least evidence that judges respond to incentives. Will judges take bribes? What concept of justice will they apply? What kind of judges do you want? Do they, what notions of justice do you want them to pursue? And do they weigh facts carefully? And actually, Richard Posner, the famous both economist and judge, wrote an article about 20 years ago called "What Do Judges Maximize?" and it had the subtitle was "The Same Thing as You and Me." So in other words, judges are just people. Basically, they presumably respond to the same incentives as any other beings, and respond to have the same frailties or characteristics of anybody else. But the point I'm trying to make here is if we think that judicial independence is an institution that is valuable, it does rest on some notion that there are people who are asked to be the key agents acting on our behalf in a system with an independent judiciary, do so in a way that is good for society. So it's a key area where I think the judgments we make and the way we think about it is important. So principal agent problems, as I'm sure most of you know, are a core concept in economics, and they arise in lots of interesting situations, particularly the kind of the social sphere that I'm interested in for the purposes of this lecture. I've been for a long time interested. Indeed, I sort of wrote a book in 2006. It's based on all this, on the wish of voters to control politicians being one of the key principal-agent relationships that we observe in society. Of course, owners of firms or trustees of non-profits wish to control the managers. I mean, they want to control the people who are being asked to run those firms, and in non-profit firms, presumably to make sure that the social purpose is fulfilled. Now, what we know, and this is a standard issue for economics, is that the ability to contract with people limits the controllability of those that we appoint to delegate positions of delegated authority. And there are classic problems, moral hazard, meaning we can't observe or control precisely what they're going to do, and adverse selection, we can't control precisely who's going to make those decisions. And a lot of the debates in economics about institution design are around the solution of principal-agent problems in some acceptable way. Now, the standard assumption, and so principal-agent problems have been properly studied in economics, so that's a bit of a loaded term, probably since around the time of Bengt Holmström's paper in 1979, which was part of his thesis, was the first to sort of write down and solve, in a sense, in a way that we would now say was an acceptable way of doing it, a principal-agent problem. And in that model, of course, he took a classical economic approach, namely of a self-interested agent who's trying to do the best they can, and with narrow objectives, and the principal is a smart principal who's trying to design an optimal set of incentives to control the agent. That's what I say, that's the acceptable way of proceeding, quite rightly, for economists. But of course, since Holmström's classic paper, we have serially expanded the model to recognize that, first of all, motivation and agency problems may extend beyond narrow interest. Namely, people may have goals other than money. I like to use this phrase, mission orientation. People care about things other than money, they care about social goals. There's recent approaches, actually, George Akerlof and Rachel Crampton have this book, some of you may have read, which really takes a very sociological perspective on this and thinks that what drives people as agents is not so much their narrow self-interest, but their sense of identity and what that dictates for how they behave in certain circumstances. Indeed, they're very influenced, and there are frequent references to Max Weber throughout their book, so it's a nice connection with the title of the lecture. And then other people have looked at issues of so-called intrinsic motivation, the idea we do many things not for the rewards that come from those things, it's because we just believe it's the right thing to do. Bruno Frey has a nice book on intrinsic motivation, for those of you who haven't read it, and he begins with a nice example, I think, which is that suppose I was going to invite a bunch of people around to my house for dinner, and I put a lot of work in the afternoon because I like these people into producing the best possible dinner that I could produce, and then they eat it and they say what a great dinner it is and they appreciate it, and somebody at the end of the dinner reaches into their wallet and says, I enjoyed that dinner so much, I'm going to give you £100. And the question is, if I'd known they were going to do that, would I produce an even better dinner thinking more people would have given me money, or would I actually try to poison the guy? And I think we all know that most human beings would be deeply offended if something they'd done for intrinsic purposes was turned into a market exchange. And we do form in our minds these distinctions, and that's often characterized as the role of intrinsic motivation. And of course, principles, the people designing the world and designing the incentive schemes themselves may have frailties, they may be poorly informed, they may have limited competence, they may be bound to be rational. And that's going to be particularly important when we think about voters, and I'm going to come to voters in a minute. And in fact, I'm going to talk about two applications from work that I've been doing. One is on the design of constraints on executive power in politics, and presumably we constrain power by having, for example, judicial independence, parliamentary control of the executive, whatever it is, because we want to try and constrain those who are in positions of authority to act more in the public interest. That's the core motivation. The other is the design of institutions which are mission orientation, particularly the choice between profit maximization or some other kind of pro-social objective in business, and I'm going to talk about that. And it's both just drawing on bits of research, very specific pieces of research that I've done, or actually am doing at the moment. So, human nature and political economy, this was something that Andrea sort of referred to, I think, in his introductory comments. There's a sort of question about what motivates politicians and what motivates voters. Now, in the case of politicians, the debate has been about the question of to what extent we should just assume that they're all out for themselves, and that's the natural assumption to make about politicians, or actually, is this a class of more high-minded individuals who are somehow acting not on the basis of narrow self-interest, but on some social good? And the interesting question also around voters: what are voters out for? Are they rational evaluators of policy? Are they subject to emotion, ideology, things that would perhaps mean they have a slightly more complex motivation? And the question is, how would our answer to those kinds of questions have a bearing on the institutions that we design? And in particular, if you take the Stars model for rationality, the frailties and imperfections mean that we want to change the amount of discretion we offer, for example, to voters. So one argument is that we allow central bankers to make decisions on an independent basis, not so much to insulate them from politicians, but actually just as much to insulate them from voters who influence politicians. That this is a deliberate attempt to reduce the sensitivity of monetary policy to popular opinion. But we're deliberately breaking that link, and that could be argued for on the basis of some view about voters not being the best judges of ultimately their own long-run welfare. That would be the kind of argument. Now, when it comes to designing political institutions, here's a couple of quotes. One, which I love, from David Hume, of course contemporary of Adam Smith, not so renowned among economics, although supposedly he invented the monetary theory of the balance of payments. Whether anyone thinks that was a great achievement anymore, I don't know. But anyway, this is his quote on the design of government. In contriving any system of government, fixing several checks and balances of the Constitution, every man ought to be supposed a knave. For those of you who need that translated, I mean somebody who's basically out to do whatever is in their own narrow interest, and to have no other end in all his actions than private interest. By this interest we must govern him, and by means of it, notwithstanding his insatiable avarice and ambition, cooperate to the public good. In other words, you really have to make the basest assumption about human nature. Of course, I should always apologize for this quote because it said every man ought to be supposed to knave. It's not gender neutral. On the other hand, most women would be happy not to be included in that particular description, I'm sure. Indeed, they would say it's probably true of every man. Anyway, and here's a much more recent quote from James Buchanan, the sadly recently departed James Buchanan, often thought of as the founder of public choice as a field in economics. He says individuals must be modeled as seeking to further their own narrow self-interest in terms of and measured net wealth position as predicted or expected. So it's become a kind of mantra that when we do our studies of politicians, we have to make this basis assumption about how they're going to behave. What about behavior of voters? Well, funnily enough, there's a kind of, I can perceive there be sort of three ways now. So if you go back to the 1950s, when people first started doing systematic studies of voting, the behavioral model of voters was the model people naturally assumed. They didn't assume rational voters who were calculating and making decisions. So Converse's early work, which actually gave rise to the Michigan studies, some of the earliest studies of voter behavior, put a lot of weight on the role of ideology and emotion and other factors in shaping how people voted. And then along came the sort of the guys trained by Riker and others in the more sort of what you might call rational choice politics school, who said, no, that's unacceptable. We should make the assumption that voters are rational and model things in the rationality tradition. And what I'm seeing now is there's a kind of group, Dan Diemeyer at Northwestern and others, who are now kind of going back to the 1950s and starting to experiment again with the models of voter behavioral voters. So you kind of, if you hang around long enough, things flip back and forth. But the traditional model of political science has been a behavioral model, not a rational choice model, in which, as I say, voters are viewed as essentially ignorant, not knowing much about policy, that they're dominated in their outlook by party loyalties and ideological preferences, that they could be irrational, they could want things that simply don't add up. They want more of everything, but they don't want their taxes to go up. As I say, the question is, does this tend to have faith in democracy? At the end of the day, that's really what matters. And it's a well-known quote by Winston Churchill that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. So the question would be, now of course we might say that this has no bearing on whether democracy is a good system or not, but there is a debate going on, and I think it would be really a mistake to be sitting here in part of the developed world with strong democratic traditions and forgetting that. I mean, there's a country of well over 1 billion people that is very ambivalent, namely China, about democracy, and is actually the shifting since the financial crisis and the fiscal crisis that have followed on from that. The argument around whether there's a persuasive case for democratic institutions as the best method, at least of economic governance, I think has been palpably weakened. And a lot of the question is, well, if you've just got these voters who are asking for stuff that's, they don't have a clue what they're doing, and moreover, they're just voting on the basis of ideology, and that's driving your system, then why should we ever think that's going to end up with sensible economic policy, if that's the way we're trying to run the world? So, there is a debate here. It's one way we may feel that we've settled this argument long ago, but I think it would be a mistake to believe that this is a debate which is entirely settled. There are two sort of broad models of politics that get studied in the political economy literature. One is democracy as representation, which I'm not going to really talk about. But the one that I really am interested in and is going to fuel what I have to say is democracy as control of politicians. That fundamentally this is the one I think is actually more important. That namely, at the end of the day, what really matters is that democracy can get rid of the people we don't really want. I would argue that, and I'm going to come back to the Hayekian theme later when I talk about that. How do we do things in democracy in pursuit of control of politicians? We pursue internal control. We put in checks and balances. We have judges that can overrule politicians if they break the law or they overstep the law, or they try and change the law in ways that contradict with fundamental rights. We also have parliaments that typically constrain what politicians can do and try and subject executives to constraints. But there's also, that's what I call system of internal control. External control, of course, is ultimately, if you don't like these guys, you can vote them out of office. And, typically in established democracies, people who are voted out of office actually leave. Now, of course, it's essentially an application of the principal agent problem. The principals in this case are the citizens, they're voters, they're members, maybe members of civil society are important too, and maybe lobby groups. And the agents are the politicians and bureaucrats in this context. So that's that application. In a minute I'm going to give you something concrete on the basis of that. Now let me talk about human nature in a slightly different context, namely in the context of private social action. So this is going beyond the state. A lot of what happens of importance doesn't just happen in government, it also happens in private institutions. And there's a big debate going on, again, in different places about to what extent we should want our private firms to pursue social actions. And here's a quote from George Soros, who says that actually most business people are upright citizens. I have no reason to dispute that. But that does not change the fact that business is conducted for private gain and not for the public benefit. The primary responsibility of managers is the owners of business, not some nebulous entity called the public interest. So this is a line of argument. Milton Friedman famously argued this in Capitalism and Freedom. Capitalism and Freedom. So essentially it's the responsibility of private business to make profit. And of course we have exceptions to that. We have non-profits. Non-profits are set up obviously not to make profits, but insofar as for-profit businesses exist, that's their role in life. Now, to what extent could we even have for-profit businesses that pursued social ends? You know, occasionally entrepreneurs will come along and say, actually, we're good guys, we're not all about maximising profit. A good example in Britain was something called the Body Shop. A Body Shop was founded by an entrepreneur, and she sold cosmetics, and her argument was, I don't believe in animal testing, I don't believe in a bunch of stuff, I'm not just going to pursue profit, I'm going to actually have a socially responsible model for my business. And the interesting question is to what extent we think human nature, non-self-interest in human nature can flower in an environment of a for-profit enterprise. Now, the key question, if you believe that it's possible for private business to pursue social ends, there's a question of how far this can actually be achieved in a marketplace. And so if you read, I don't know if any of you read Bob Schiller's most recent book, not the Animal Spirits book with George Acklock, but one that he's brought out more recently about how to change the financial system. And his argument is basically as long as you have for-profit, standard private financial firms, you're going to get what we've always had, which is financial crises from time to time driven by the excesses of the financial system. The only way to change this is to fundamentally change the kinds of businesses that we have. And the reason is ultimately shareholders desire profit maximization. Indeed, the law says that shareholders have a right to expect from management profit maximization. So even if you have managers who explicitly say we're going to pursue social ends, that turns out to actually be illegal in the context of standard business. Now, of course, we do observe non-profit businesses whose aim is charitable. But even there's a question of how far can you actually limit the role of self-interest, even in such businesses. And we've had a recent spate of cases where non-profits or charities in the UK have been charged with effectively becoming tax avoidance measures. So people can put money into non-profit businesses essentially to avoid taxation and to find ways around non-profit rules. Now, whether that's true or not, we will find out eventually whether any of these cases are established. But that's an example of how actually even with an organisation set up with a particular motivation, you can observe self-interest eventually winning out. And of course there's a kind of middle ground, and I'm not going to talk about this, although it's actually a major topic in some of the research I'm doing, is whether there can be a middle ground called social business, which is a viable alternative to non-profit or for-profit activity. Now, what's common to the two examples I've given you is that institutions are trying to respond to incentives. So if we decide to set up a non-profit firm or a for-profit firm, we're trying to anticipate the incentives of people who are going to run those organizations. Or if we establish democratic institutions, we're trying to respond to incentives. But also in the way we think about that working, the motivation and behavior of the principals and the agents really matter. Now, I'm going to argue that behind all of this, now this is taking sort of a slight left turn, but actually I'm going to relate it back to something that I think is important, is we're unlikely to know what the right model of human motivation is. I think it's dangerous if we believe, and this is where I began to sort of get into this topic, because I sort of read, as everyone has, some of these lab experiments that seem to expose difficulties with certain very classic rationality models in economics, and people don't sometimes seem to adhere to those models, and that's somewhat disturbing, I think, at least enough to make you think. And it does, but the way I want to think of this is actually model uncertainty. I'm guessing that there are lots of people out there in the world. Some are self-interested, some are maybe not self-interested. It's going to be quite hard to predict who they are. It turns out when I run these Perry tests, the ones I was telling you about, that do tests for pro-social motivation, they are correlated with pro-social behavior, but they're not a particularly strong predictor of pro-social behavior. So there are ways of trying to improve the predictability of people's behavior, but it's always going to be imperfect. It's going to be very hard for us to say human nature is of one kind. People are rational always in this way. And if you think about Danny Kahneman's recent book, I'm Thinking Fast and Slow, if any of you have read it, he basically talks about the fact that we don't even have a kind of single notion of rationality. He talks about level 1 and level 2. But the point is that it seems unlikely there'll be something called the true model. If there is a true model, the odds that we will understand it are quite low. So I want to think of the problem as a problem of model uncertainty. And I'm going to suggest an approach based on an idea that's become quite popular in macro called robust control. That what we want to do is we want to have institutions that work robustly. We want them to work, well, probably in the worst case scenario. And what the economic analysis can allow us to do is to think about what the worst case scenario is, and then hopefully if we have institutions that work then they're pretty robust, they're going to work well. And I think that's what Hume was saying actually, and it's definitely what Hayek was saying in terms of Smith. Let's think of what works well, not when people are the best they can be, but when they're the worst they can be. And I want to put some flesh on the bones of that idea. Now, robust control is a very popular idea in engineering. And this is a quote, and I'm not going to read the whole of it, from a course you can download from Carnegie Mellon, which is an engineering course. It turns out, for example, in aeronautical engineering, robust control is a common method of analysis, which is essentially worst case scenario. And if you think about one area where worst case scenario is taken more seriously than anywhere else, it's regulation in aircraft safety. You recall the whole fleet of Dreamliners was grounded because of a battery fault, which hadn't yet even manifested itself in a single fatality. Essentially, it was an application of robust control. We figured out that there was going to be some probability of an incredibly bad accident where presumably these batteries would have kind of caused a catastrophic mid-air failure in one of these airplanes, so the whole fleet was immediately grounded. That's an application of robust control, is looking at the worst possible thing that can happen and essentially making an economic decision on the basis of that. Now, robust control has been looked at a little bit in economics. There's a book by Hansen and Sargent and a bunch of papers by Hansen and Sargent where they use it to look, for example, at monetary policy making. And there's a link here to work on ambiguity. Gabler and Schmeidler, who are two decision theorists, done a lot of work on the fundamental theory here. And in microeconomics, the only real person I think who's been doing this systematically is Chuck Mansky at Northwestern, who's been doing work on policy evaluation when we don't know the true model. But by and large, economists still labour under the belief that there's very little ambiguity. They can attach probability distributions to outcomes and they'll behave in a way that sort of maximises some weighted sum of possible outcomes. Now, the problem is that in terms of the sort of basic science of this, there's no universally agreed upon framework for thinking about decision making when we don't know the true model. In the work I'm going to show you, I've basically taken the crudest thing we could possibly do, which is to look at the worst case scenarios, which is what the simplest application of robust control is. So I'm going to basically take a max-min approach. You don't have to take a max-min approach, but it's an easy approach to operationalize and look at models from that point of view. But in some other work I've been doing, I've tried to take other approaches, and in fact, Chuck Mansky looks at maximum regret and other concepts. You could apply any concept of robust control you want. So I'm interested in when the test of, so maybe the economic model got it right all along. I'm interested in asking the question, if we assume self-interest and rationality, is that the worst case scenario? Actually, I don't think it always is. And so actually, if we go with the classic economic case of doing that, we can end up in trouble. But that's a possibility. We have to build in different assumptions and find out what the worst case scenario is, which will of course be very context specific. There's no such thing as the worst case scenario. It will be model specific for particular institutional arrangements. So that's why I want to focus on two concrete applications from ongoing research. Let me now go back to democracy and executive constraints. So actually, I basically think that if you say what's important about democracies, elections are a sideshow. One of the biggest problems we've gotten into in recent problems with the Americans in particular, I'm going to blame it on the Americans, but it's not just them, it's kind of Western thinking more generally, have said what we do when we democratize is we have elections. Unfortunately, if you have elections in situations where you give unconstrained power to people, that's a big problem. But really, what's fundamental to democracy is not elections, it's executive constraints. And you've already argued. So actually, if you go to the Polity4 database, which is the one that most people use when they actually look empirically at democracy, it has a three-dimensional classification of democracies or political institutions. One of them is executive constraints, and the other two are essentially to do with the contestability of political power, and elections enter into that contestability. Now, here's a picture. It's a picture I've often stared at and read far more into than I should ever be allowed to. But here's a picture of economic growth since 1950 in the world, looking at deviations from trends. So I've allowed each country in the data to have a trend, and I've allowed, so I can look at different growth paths. And I'm separating the sample into countries that have weak executive constraints in the data, and countries that have strong executive constraints in the data. And effectively, this is a very robust picture that you get out of looking at the data in different ways. The red, essentially what you find is that there's a very small positive effect of having strong executive constraints on the level of income. It's around 2% a year. So the blue curve, it's very hard to see from this, but the mean of the distribution is slightly higher for the blue curve than the red curve. But the more interesting fact, and the one that motivates what I want to talk about, is the shape of the distribution. Essentially, countries with weak executive constraints tend to either have much worse performance, and in fact, in a few cases, have much better performance. So China, think of China, or Singapore before it democratized. Well, it's still not actually according to the data of democracy. Or South Korea. Essentially, you get more countries in the top part of the distribution and more countries in the bottom part of the distribution. And to me, that's very natural. I have a model that I've worked on, and I'm going to calibrate to the data, but I'm not going to show you any of the gory details. That essentially argues that once you limit discretion in a political system, which you do under executive constraints, you're often going to limit good discretion at the price of getting rid of bad discretion. In other words, you may limit the ability of politicians to screw up, but at the same time you limit their ability perhaps to occasionally do really good things. And that's why you naturally would expect to get a picture like this in the data. But this is the picture that I want to use to think about this. Now, the usual thing that economists have done when they look at these data is just look at the means, not the distributions. There's a few papers that have looked at the distribution. I'm not the first person to point out this difference in the shape of the distribution. Now, the question is, though, if I look at the really bad outcomes in the data, so now what you can do is you can say, where were all those, look at this, where are all these bad outcomes happening? Now, in a theoretical model that I've worked on to calibrate to these data, I'm trying to argue that from a theoretical point of view, when will the principal agent problem be solved least well in politics? It's going to be when voters are very bad at controlling politicians, and it's going to be when the politicians are themselves particularly selfish. Okay, so the worst case scenario, and you can't get rid of them. So you're not going to get rid of them even if you can, if the voters are not able to exercise the kind of control. Okay. So I'm going to argue that from a theoretical point of view, you'd be driven to look at that bottom tail. You'd be driven to interpret that in terms of the cases where the problem of self-interest and the problem of irrationality is greatest. And the robust comparison is going to be to look at those bottoms here and ask the question, how much better should you do? So what I've done is I take this model, and this is in some recent research, which isn't even a working paper yet, but is about to be, and calibrate a principal agent model to the data. So in other words, I almost excessively take the model seriously. I calibrate it to various moments in the data, and to explain the mean variance of the performance of countries under these different political regimes. And I can look at, essentially then construct something called the worst performing country under weak executive constraints, and the worst performing country under strong executive constraints. How much better does the worst performing country under strong executive constraints perform? The answer is 73% better than the country under weak executive constraints. In other words, the robust comparison says that having strong executive constraints is 73% better. It's worth 73% of GDP, whereas the mean effect was just 2%. Now, it's not surprising, looking at the max-min, you might get bigger outcomes. But remember, I'm being maximally pessimistic about both regimes. I'm comparing like with like. So that's an example of the application of this logic, and I'm motivating that from the view that these are going to be the cases where human motivation is most likely to be problematic. And human nature is most likely to be causing us to have the worst possible outcome. Here's a second application, which comes from stuff that's even more recent, which is a lab experiment I've been running in the last, literally in the last month, and I'll show you some results. The one thing, for anyone I'm kind of new to lab experiments, so the problem is whenever I'm new to anything, I get too excited about it and forget all the drawbacks, but let me tell you what was exciting. What was most exciting is we ran this lab experiment, and we ran it on Monday through Thursday evening, and on Friday I was already analysing the data. You know, sitting there on my computer, and I could already start analysing the data like after 4 days. Now, I once ran a survey in South India, a household survey. It took like about 6 months before I could start analysing the data. So this is kind of quite seductive to be able to get the data and study it like literally within. You could do it within minutes. I mean, I could have been doing it on Thursday evening, I guess, if I'd been that information. Anyway, the role of the lab experiment was to look at different forms of incentives within firms, in particular trying to look at non-profit versus for-profit incentives. And in particular, we rewarded people in our lab in the form of either contributions to good causes or contributions to their own income, which they could take away at the end of the lab, okay, at the end of the experiment. We gave them tasks to do in the lab to put in effort. The task that they did was extremely boring. The sad thing about it, so we mainly recruited from LSE students, not entirely, some LSE staff. And one thing we could look at was so this was a computer-based task where you basically had to align a slider on a screen to exactly halfway. So there was 0 to 100, you had to put it at 50. And you had to do that as many times as you could in 2 minutes. And I can tell you, if you think that sounds easy, I'm more than happy to let you try it. But the sad thing about it, I was telling you, they're mostly LSE students. The negative gradient with age was unbelievable. So the young guys do this task so much better. So I got my 17-year-old son to do it, and he was just like click, 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 click. You know, so kids who play computer games are pretty good at it. They're not that good at it that we didn't get effects, but there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in terms of ability. And the interesting question though is, do people respond to incentives in doing that task? There's an AER paper, 2012, by Gill and Prowse, who we didn't have the idea of running this task, who showed that with some effect comparing piece rates with fixed wages, and it appeared that people responded to incentives. So that's why we decided to use this task as the basis for our thing. But we also allowed people to choose how the money they created through the task was used. Would the money be kept? Would the money be given away? Now I'm going to show you a contrast where we exogenously imposed. We told them in some rounds of the experiment, you're either going to give this money to charity or you're going to keep it for yourself. So I was interested in how non-profit incentives might vary from for-profit incentives, and in particular if we could say anything about that. Okay, and we also created, as I say, a multitask principal agent problem where they could both choose the mission, the cause, and choose their effort. So it was a fun experiment to run, and we only, we had about 250 people in this experiment, and we asked them to play the task about 11 times. So we have multiple data. As I say, the one thing we learned is that there's a huge competence effect, but it's also an effect of incentives. So people who, when we incentivize people for doing this task, they did more of it. And on average, they did about they put in about 5% less effort on average when we were giving the money to charity. So there was a difference. The sad truth of the world is that people appear to be somewhat selfish, namely they work less hard on this task when the money's going to charity than it is when they're keeping it for themselves. But what we noticed when we gave them a choice about whether they did it, about 83% of people chose to keep the money. If we gave them a choice between keeping the money or donating it, and we doubled their money, by the way, when they gave the money to charity. So they could either keep a pound for themselves or give £2 to charity. And only about 17% of people ever did that. So, in the world, the economist's assumption that people are selfish, perhaps you didn't need reminding them. It turns out to be true about 83% of the time. But we did find people, when we even allowed them to give only 20 pence to charity rather than a pound, there were some people who would rather give 20 pence to charity than a pound. 7% of people were willing to give 20 pence rather than keep it for themselves. So there were some really altruistic people out there who were willing, to forego. Anyway, so we run this experiment. We basically then, what we do is we take a model of human behavior incredibly seriously, and we again, like I did for the other thing, I calibrate the model to the data. I actually estimate a bunch of parameters, the elasticity of effort with respect to reward, and a bunch of other stuff. I calibrate people's ability. I can measure their ability because I see them doing the same task repeated times. And I can also calibrate their extent of pro-social motivation by looking at how often they chose to forego private earnings to go and give the money to charity. And actually that correlates well with some of these Perry scores, these pro-social motivation scores. Now, how if I want to, so now I'm an entrepreneur, I'm founding a firm, and I could either start a non-profit firm or I could start a for-profit firm. Now, of course, it's going to depend on what I want to do. Do I actually am I a pro-social guy myself when I found the business? But suppose I want to have people run this business. And I want to ask the question, well, what kind of people am I going to have showing up? Now, we allow in the experiment, I'm not going to talk about that, some self-selection. We let people pick which kind of organization they worked in, but I'm not going to talk about that now. What I'm going to show you is what would happen. I'm going to take the pessimistic thing, the economist there. I'm going to I'm going to look at the lowest ability type, but I'm in particular going to look at the selfish guys and think, what would happen if the world was run by selfish people? What would the returns look like? And so what I've done here, and I can't explain the sort of detail of what I've done here, these are measures of the payoffs to running these organizations. And I'm only picking three types of people. The high goals are people who are very strong, who show a very strong sense of pro-social motivation. They're the guys who would rather give 20 pence to charity than keep a pound for themselves. The next lot of guys are the guys who would rather give £2 to charity than keep a pound for themselves. And the bottom lot of guys are guys who would never give anything to charity under either of those conditions. They just prefer to keep the money even if they could give £2 to charity. And each dot is a participant in our experiment. Okay? And these are the payoffs, and we construct a measure of profit for an organization. To be clear to the economist president, we construct total surplus for these organizations. What we do, and this is, suppose I'm a motivated founder, I want this organization to contribute to charity. I actually like charitable contributions. Okay? Then for-profit is going to be the blue dots. It doesn't matter whether people are motivated in a for-profit because if they don't have the contribution, they can't go and give the money to charity. So that gives us a benchmark payoff. Now notice, non-profits staffed by selfish guys are about as good as for-profits. At the end of the day, you don't create anything by having them run. But if you were able to get the selfish guys in, the motivated guys in, if there was self-selection, then you would be able to have higher payoffs in that case. So here it does rely on your believing that you can get a method of selection to get non-motivated guys, so to get motivated guys. So that's the case where I'm motivated now. But suppose I actually don't like what these guys are doing with their money, and I actually view it as a private benefit. So I just think, well, why should I allow these guys to enrich themselves on the back of some cause that I don't believe in? So that's this case here. Now notice here, now I actually actively dislike non-profit organizations with selfish guys, because they're not working very hard, they're actually working less hard, and moreover they're not giving anything, they're also not giving anything to the cause that I don't really like, because they're foregoing. So those are the green dots down below. But notice now, for-profit organization is sort of robust, because now, compared to getting the guys I don't really like, but notice I can make a hell of a lot of money off the motivated guys. So actually, I wouldn't still mind having my organization staffed by guys who love the cause. In other words, I really want people working in, if I'm Goldman Sachs, I actually don't want just people who like money, who actually believe that Goldman Sachs does good in the world, because those guys are actually going to work much harder for me. And those are the top guys up there. They're actually working incredibly hard, believing they're doing a lot of good, and they're actually, even in a, so that would make the world a better place. So, essentially then, what I'm trying to argue here is that the same debate that I produced earlier about what we think is the optimal organizational form and the degree of pro-social motivation is key to understanding whether we think one type of organization is better than another. Okay, so I've kind of covered quite a range of the terrain. What I tried to argue is the way to think about the problem of human motivation is to think of that as a problem of model uncertainty. And to think about robust approaches to the design of institutions that don't rest on us knowing the true model, that allow us to analyze organizations under assumptions about worst-case scenarios. And in fact, that was exactly Hayek's view of the market. Hayek's view was that the market may have all sorts of failings, but indeed, it works best when you make the worst assumptions about people. And if you try and set up a set of institutions, the case for the market is it's predictable. It works the way we think. Now, of course, it's not quite predictable, because if you have these motivated guys, as I've argued here, they can behave differently in private organizations set up to run on a pro-social basis. But by and large, the economists, so it's partly a defense of the economist's approach, really. It's saying that maybe the way to design institutions is to take seriously the idea that we need to look at the worst cases, and that can very often be when the traditional economic model, at least as far as self-interest goes, applies. Anyway, so those are my thoughts, and I'd be very happy to listen to any questions or comments. Thank you very much. From a theoretical point of view, when will the principal agent problem be solved least well in politics? It's going to be when voters are very bad at controlling politicians, and it's going to be when the politicians are themselves particularly selfish. Okay, so the worst case scenario, and you can't get rid of it. So you're not going to get rid of them even if you can, if the voters are not able to exercise the kind of control. Okay. So I'm going to argue that from a theoretical point of view, you'd be driven to look at that bottom tail. You'd be driven to interpret that in terms of the cases where the problem of self-interest and the problem of irrationality is greatest. And the robust comparison is going to be to look at those bottoms here and ask the question, how much better should you do? So what I've done is I take this model, and this is in some recent research, which isn't even a working paper yet, but is about to be, and calibrate a principal agent model to the data. So in other words, I almost excessively take the model seriously. I calibrate it to various moments in the data, and to explain the mean and variance of the performance of countries under these different political regimes. And I can look at, essentially then construct something called the worst performing country under weak executive constraints, and the worst performing country under strong executive constraints. How much better does the worst performing country under strong executive constraints perform? The answer is 73% better than the country under weak executive constraints. In other words, the robust comparison says that having strong executive constraints is 73% better. It's worth 73% of GDP, whereas the mean effect was just 2%. Now, it's not surprising, looking at the maximum, you might get bigger outcomes. But remember, I'm being maximally pessimistic about both regimes. I'm comparing like with like. So that's an example of the application of this logic, and I'm motivating that from the view that these are going to be the cases where human motivation is most likely to be problematic, and human nature is most likely to be causing us to have the worst possible outcome. Here's a second application, which comes from stuff that's even more recent, which is a lab experiment I've been running in the last, literally in the last month, and I'll show you some results. The one thing, for anyone I'm kind of new to lab experiments, so the problem is whenever I'm new to anything, I get too excited about it and forget all the drawbacks, but let me tell you what was exciting. What was most exciting is we ran this lab experiment, and we ran it on Monday through Thursday evening, and on Friday I was already analysing the data. You know, sitting there on my computer, I could already start analysing the data like after 4 days. Now, I once ran a survey in South India, a household survey. It took like about 6 months before I could start analysing the data. So this is kind of quite seductive to be able to get the data and study it like literally within. You could do it within minutes. I mean, I could have been doing it on Thursday evening, I guess, if I did that information. Anyway, the role of the lab experiment was to look at different forms of incentives within firms, in particular trying to look at non-profit versus for-profit incentives. And in particular, we rewarded people in our lab in the form of either contributions to good causes or contributions to their own income, which they could take away at the end of the lab, okay, at the end of the experiment. We gave them tasks to do in the lab to put in effort. The task that they did was extremely boring. The sad thing about it, so we mainly recruited from LSE students, not entirely, some LSE staff. And one thing we could look at was so this was a computer-based task where you basically had to align a slider on a screen to exactly halfway. So there was 0 to 100, you had to put it at 50. And you had to do that as many times as you could in 2 minutes. And I can tell you, if you think that sounds easy, I'm more than happy to let you try it. But the sad thing about it, I was telling you, they're mostly LSE students. The negative gradient with age was unbelievable. So the young guys do this task so much better. So I got my 17-year-old son to do it, and he was just like click, 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 click. You know, so kids who play computer games are pretty good at it. They're not that good at it that we didn't get effects, but there's a huge amount of heterogeneity in terms of ability. And the interesting question though is, do people respond to incentives in doing that task? There's an AER paper 2012 by Gill and Prowse, who we didn't have the idea of running this task, who showed that with some effect comparing piece rates with fixed wages, and it appeared that people responded to incentives. So that's why we decided to use this task as the basis for our thing. But we also allowed people to choose how the money they created through the task was used. Would the money be kept? Would the money be given away? Now I'm just going to show you a contrast where we exogenously imposed. We told them in some rounds of the experiment, you're either going to give this money to charity or you're going to keep it for yourself. So I was interested in how non-profit incentives might vary from for-profit incentives, and in particular if we could say anything about that. Okay? And we also created, as I say, a multitask principal agent problem where they could both choose the mission, the cause, and choose their effort. So it was a fun experiment to run, and we only, we had about 250 people in this experiment, and we asked them to play the task about 11 times. So we have multiple data. As I say, the one thing we learned is that there's a huge competence effect, but there's also an effect of incentives. So people who, when we incentivized people for doing this task, they did more of it. And on average, they put in about 5% less effort on average when we were giving the money to charity. So there was a difference. The sad truth of the world is that people appear to be somewhat selfish, namely they work less hard on this task when the money's going to charity than it is when they're keeping it for themselves. But what we noticed when we gave them a choice about whether they did it, about 83% of people chose to keep the money. If we gave them a choice between keeping the money or donating it, and we doubled their money, by the way, when they gave the money to charity. So they could either keep a pound for themselves, or give £2 to charity. And only about 17% of people ever did that. So, in the world, the economist's assumption that people are selfish, perhaps you didn't need reminding them. It turns out to be true about 83% of the time. But we did find people, when we even allowed them to give only 20 pence to charity rather than £1, there were some people who would rather give 20 pence to charity than £1. There's 7% of people who were willing to give 20 pence rather than keep it for themselves. So there's some really altruistic people out there who are willing, to forego. Anyway, so we run this experiment. We basically then, what we do is we take a model of human behavior incredibly seriously, and we again, like I did for the other thing, I calibrate the model to the data. I actually estimate a bunch of parameters, the elasticity of effort with respect to reward, and a bunch of other stuff. I calibrate people's ability. I can measure their ability because I see them doing the same task repeated times. And I can also calibrate their extent of pro-social motivation by looking at how often they chose to forego private earnings to go and give the money to charity. And actually that correlates well with some of these Perry scores, these pro-social motivation scores. Now, how if I want to, so now I'm an entrepreneur and I'm founding a firm, and I could either start a non-profit firm or I could start a for-profit firm. Now, of course, it's going to depend on what I want to do. Do I actually want the, am I a pro-social guy myself when I found the business? But suppose I want to have people run this business. And I want to ask the question, well, what kind of people am I going to have showing up? Now, we allow in the experiment, I'm not going to talk about that, some self-selection. We let people pick which kind of organization they worked in, but I'm not going to talk about that now. What I'm going to show you is what would happen. I'm going to take the pessimistic thing, the economist now. I'm going to take, actually, I'm going to look at the lowest ability type, but I'm in particular going to look at the selfish guys and think, what would happen if the world was run by selfish people? What would the returns look like? And here's so what I've done here, and I can't explain the sort of detail of what I've done here. These are measures of the payoffs to running these organizations. And I'm only picking three types of people. The high dots are people who are very strong, who show a very strong sense of pro-social motivation. They're the guys who would rather give 20 pence to charity than keep £1 for themselves. The next lot of guys are the guys who would rather give £2 to charity than keep £1 for themselves. And the bottom lot of guys are guys who would never give anything to charity under either of those conditions. They just prefer to keep the money even if they could give £2 to charity. And each dot is a participant in our experiment. Okay? And these are the payoffs, and we construct a measure of profit for an organization. To be clear to the economist president, we construct total surplus for these organizations. What we do, and this is, suppose I'm a motivated founder, I want this organization to contribute to charity. I actually like charitable contributions. Okay? Then for-profit is going to be the blue dots. It doesn't matter whether people are motivated in a for-profit because if they don't have the contribution, they can't go and give the money to charity. So that gives us a benchmark payoff. Now notice, non-profits staffed by selfish guys are about as good as for-profits. At the end of the day, you don't create anything by having them run. But if you're able to get the selfish guys in, the motivated guys in, if there was self-selection, then you would be able to have higher payoffs in that case. So here it does rely on your believing that you can get a method of selection to get non-motivated guys, so to get motivated guys. So that's the case where I'm a motivated founder. But suppose I actually don't like what these guys are doing with their money, and I actually view it as a private benefit. So I just think, well, why should I allow these guys to enrich themselves on the back of some cause that I don't believe in? So that's this case here. Now notice here, now I actually actively dislike non-profit organizations with selfish guys, because they're not working very hard. They're actually working less hard, and moreover, they're not giving anything. They're also not giving anything to the cause that I don't really like, because they're foregoing. So those are the green dots down below. But notice now, for-profit organization is sort of robust, because now, compared to getting the guys I don't really like, but notice I can make a hell of a lot of money off the motivated guys. So actually, I wouldn't still mind having my organization staffed by guys who love the cause. In other words, I really want people working in, if I'm Goldman Sachs, I actually don't want just people who like money, who actually believe that Goldman Sachs does good in the world, because those guys are actually going to work much harder for me. And those are the top guys up there. They're actually working incredibly hard, believing they're doing a lot of good, and they're actually, even in a, so that would make the world a better place. So, essentially then, what I'm trying to argue here is that the same debate that I produced earlier about what we think is the optimal organizational form and the degree of processual motivation is key to understanding whether we think one type of organization is better than another. Okay, so I've kind of covered quite a range of terrain. What I tried to argue is the way to think about the problem of human motivation is to think of that as a problem of model uncertainty. And to think about robust approaches to the design of institutions that don't rest on us knowing the true model, that allow us to analyze organizations under assumptions about worst-case scenarios. And in fact, that was exactly Hayek's view of the market. Hayek's view was that the market may have all sorts of failings, but indeed, it works best when you make the worst assumptions about people. And if you try and set up a set of institutions, the case for the market is it's predictable. It works the way we think. Now, of course, it's not quite predictable, because if you have these motivated guys, as I've argued here, they can behave differently in private organizations set up to run on a process basis. But by and large, the economists, so it's partly a defense of the economist's approach, really. It's saying that maybe the way to design institutions is to take seriously the idea that we need to look at the worst cases, and that can very often be when the traditional economic model, at least as far as self-interest goes, applies. Anyway, so those are my thoughts, and I'm very happy to listen to any questions or comments. Thank you very much.